The whole disaster kicked off when the HOA president barged into my cabin mid-beer with the state's attorney general. No warning, no knock. She literally kicked in the door, heels crunching through splintered wood like an action movie villain. She charged inside wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my entire truck and reeking of that aggressive perfume that announces itself from a mile away. She started screeching about violations and jurisdiction, completely unaware that she'd just committed half a dozen felonies in front of the one person in the country who had the authority to throw her in prison on the spot. Even worse, for her, she was live-streaming the entire meltdown to 3,000 people, effectively filming her own arrest warrant. 6 months earlier, I honestly thought she was just another power-hungry hoe Karen. Turns out she was running a $4 million embezzlement operation, and I was about to accidentally bring the entire thing crashing down. So let me ask you, a broken bar, what would you do if some homaniac stormed your private property in the middle of the most important meeting of your life? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from. I guarantee half of you have dealt with these neighborhood tyrants. Let me rewind so you know how this nightmare even began. Back then, life was pretty damn great. My name's Marcus Handley, I'm 52, and after spending 3 decades crawling through muddy trenches installing power grids across 3 counties, I finally earned my retirement. The prize? My grandfather's fishing cabin on Clearwater Lake, 2 acres of pure heaven that old Pop bought back in 1963 for $800. $800. And now that same slice of lakefront is worth more than most people's houses. This place isn't some fancy modern mansion either. It's old school, hand-hewn logs, a stone fireplace Pop built with his own calloused hands, and a screened-in porch that creaks just right when the breeze rolls in. I kept it totally off the grid on purpose, solar panels quietly humming on the roof, well water that tasted like childhood, and a septic system that actually worked better than half the city setups I've seen. Every morning I watched mist rise off the lake and remembered why Pop used to tell me, the land chooses you, not the other way around. He also warned me, when someone wants your land real bad, find out why it's usually worth more than they're admitting. I didn't understand what he meant a broken bar until she arrived. Delilah Cromwell, as everyone later started calling her, the hoe psycho, rolled into our peaceful lake community like a tornado in designer clothing. 58 years old and fresh from some California suburb where acting like a neighborhood dictator must have been a full-time job. She cruised around in a pearl white Escalade with vanity plates that literally said Rule 1 and wore her HOA president badge like a sheriff's star. Her mission? Transform our rustic lakeside into what she called an upscale resort community. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but here's what I didn't know back then. 3 elderly couples had already sold their cabins to interested buyers within 2 months of her arrival. Her first act of war hit on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting on Pop's porch drinking coffee and watching a pair of loons teach their babies to dive when I heard the sharp click 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 of high heels on my wooden dock. At 7 a.m., on my private property. 10 minutes later, she slapped an official-looking notice on my screen door. Violation citation. Unsightly dock structure lowering property values. $500 fine. Compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties will accrue. I thought it was a joke. That weather dock had the one Pop and I rebuilt when I was 12 and I saw her. Being reasonable, I walked over to explain that my property existed decades before the HOA even existed. She just smirked and, with her hands on her hips, said, "Everyone on this lake answers to me, sweetie. Ask the Hendersons how fighting me worked out." The Hendersons, a broken bar, my elderly neighbors. The same couple who suddenly decided to downsize last month after 23 years. Something cold crawled down my spine. Then she started photographing everything a broken bar, walking around my cabin like a real estate inspector, taking pictures of my solar panels, my vegetable garden, even Pop's hand-carved porch railings. Her Escalade sat idling the whole time, pumping out that nauseating chemical air freshener. By the end of the week, I had 3 more citations. Each one came with bigger fines. By then, it was obvious Delilah Cromwell wasn't just nitpicking. She declared war on everything my family had built, and I made the mistake of assuming this was just another entitled hoe bully. What I didn't realize was that I'd just become a target in something far more dangerous. Pop's warning echoed in my mind again. Find out why they want your land. I was about to find out, and it would change everything. 3 days after I ignored her ridiculous deadline, there was no way I was tearing down Pop's dock. A certified letter arrived and it made my morning coffee go bitter. Cease and desist. Violation of community waterway regulations. The letterhead read Blackstone, Meyer Associates, say one of those law firms where the partners probably bill more per hour than I ever made in a month. In fancy legal jargon, they claimed my dock was illegally extending into the community waterway a broken bar and that I owed $3,000 in back fines. They even threatened to slap a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 10 days. My first instinct, panic. They had lawyers. I had a toolbox and a short temper. But then I remembered one of Pop's other rules from those long fishing days. When someone tries to legal talk you out of your land, the real truth is always in the county records. Don't trust what they say, go look at the papers yourself. So that's exactly what I did. The thing about county courthouses is all the real information usually gets buried under layers of dusty folders and outdated binders. Thankfully, the clerk on duty, a kind woman named Betty who still remembered Pop from his old fishing tournament days, helped me track down the original survey records. One thing I'd learned from my union years was to always check the original documents before letting some suit intimidate you with fancy legal jargon. What I found in those records made my blood run hot. Not only did my grandfather's property reach the water's edge a broken bar, it actually extended 50 feet into the lake. The original deed from 1963, stamped and certified, was crystal clear. That dock wasn't even close to trespassing on community land. It was sitting squarely in my section of the lake. And to top it off, the hoe didn't even exist until 1998, 35 years after Pop bought the place. I remembered an old lesson from my foreman. Older properties often come with grandfathered rights that no homeowners association can touch. Feeling proud, and armed with copies of everything, I headed back to the cabin. That feeling lasted about as long as it took me to discover Karen's Escalade parked sideways across my driveway, blocking it completely like she was running her own personal checkpoint. When I tapped on her window, she cracked it just enough to smile and say, "Oh Marcus, I'm just reviewing the community parking regulations. This might take a while." The mix of the idling engine and that overpowering perfume made the moment feel like a twisted fever dream. Imagine a grown man who helped build half the county's infrastructure trapped in his own driveway buying whole queen with a power trip. And that was just the beginning. Within days, she'd formed something called the Lakeside Beautification Committee. Sounds harmless, right? In reality, it was a hit squad designed to pressure anyone who didn't fit her country club vision. Neighbors who'd waved to me for years suddenly crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Her Facebook posts were full of thinly veiled attacks. Concerned about eyesore properties lowering our home value as a broken bar # Lakeside strong # protect property values. The comments turned into a mob. People I'd known for decades started parroting her as if she were some kind of real estate prophet. 3 neighbors quietly pulled me aside to apologize. Tom and Susan Martinez admitted Karen had encouraged them to file complaints about my property or face their own wave of citations. Mr. Peterson got hit for having non-regulation flower boxes. The young couple next door had been threatened over their kid's swing set. "She has dirt on everyone," Tom whispered, glancing around like Karen might pop out of a bush with the camera. "And her husband works at the state capitol." A broken bar political connections. That night, I discovered orange spray paint all over my mailbox, giant letters, "Comply or leave." My solar-powered security camera, hidden behind a pine tree, caught everything including her license plate as she drove away at 2:30 in the morning. When I reported it to the sheriff, a broken bar, guess who showed up? Deputy Chad Cromwell, Karen's nephew. He glanced at the mess and shrugged. "Probably just some kids." The paint scrapped against my fingers like sandpaper while I tried to clean it off. Pop's voice came back loud and clear in my mind. Sometimes you need bigger guns for a bigger fight. Karen's next move came disguised as civic duty, which somehow made it even worse. She realized brute force wasn't working, so she started using the county bureaucracy as a weapon. First came Building Inspector Dale Morrison, a guy I'd actually worked with in the past. From the look on his face, I knew he didn't want to be there. "Marcus, I am really sorry. Someone filed a complaint about unpermitted structures. I have to check it out." 3 hours later, after crawling through every inch of my cabin with his tape measure and clipboard, he admitted everything was not just up to code that exceeded standards. Pop might have been old school, but he built things right. The next day, Environmental Officer Janet Bennett arrived to investigate a claim that my septic system was contaminating the lake. Again, a totally clean. Then Fire Marshal Bob Rodriguez showed up to check for solar panel fire hazards. No issues there either. But every bogus report created a new official record, slowly painting me as a problem property owner on paper even though everything was perfectly legal. Meanwhile, Karen was busy playing the media. She got herself a spot on Channel 7's Community Spotlight, acting like some kind of heroic defender of the environment. They aired carefully cropped shots of my cabin to make it look like a run-down dump. She talked about dangerous structures and protecting children's safety, even filmed her segment standing on my dock at the same dock she claimed was illegal. My phone lit up with angry texts from neighbors who'd seen the broadcast. Half the community now believed I was an environmental threat. But that's when Karen overplayed her hand. My old buddy Jake Martinez from the Electricians Union saw the segment and called me immediately. "Marcus, she's full of it, and everybody knows it. You literally built half the clean energy systems in this county." 2 days later, Jake organized a parade of 20 master electricians to come by and publicly inspect my property. Turns out when 24 certified professionals vouch for your work, a broken bar, the hazardous installation narrative dies real quick. My old friend Chuck Davis say we played on the same high school football team may stop by for a beer and casually dropped a bombshell. "You know, Marcus, the Attorney General's office has been investigating corruption in HOAs across the state," he said. "Several communities have reported the exact same kind of harassment you're describing." I asked him what kind of patterns he meant, though deep down I already had a pretty good idea. Elderly homeowners getting hammered with bogus citations, property values driven down on purpose, mysterious cash buyers swooping in right after people finally give up and sell. Sound familiar? It sounded like a checklist of everything I'd been dealing with. Chuck said the AG's office was looking for witnesses, people who had documentation and could prove a long-term pattern of abuse. "Someone like you could be exactly what they need." Silence filled the room for a moment. Even the refrigerator seemed too loud. That's when it finally hit me. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry neighbor, she might be part of something organized and massive. That night, I started logging everything, every citation, every inspection, every random knock on my door. I also started digging deeper into Karen's background. Turns out her husband, Robert Cromwell, wasn't some harmless government clerk. He was the state Democratic Party treasurer, which meant access to development plans, zoning documents, political favors, a broken bar, a pipeline straight into anything useful for a land grab. Normally, the combination of fresh coffee and early morning lake air gave me peace. Now it just reminded me that I had something worth taking, and someone was actively trying to take it. That's when Karen shifted tactics. Bureaucratic harassment had gotten her nowhere, so she moved on to a full-blown character assassination campaign. It started with a Facebook post that punched me in the gut. "Urgent safety alert. Aggressive behavior observed from lakefront resident. Please keep children away from the eastern shore. Protective legal measures will be pursued. #lakeside safety #protect our kids. Aggressive behavior." Me, the guy who'd helped organize the kids' fishing derby every summer for 15 years. The post got shared 43 times in just a few hours. Suddenly, people I'd never even met were publicly calling me unhinged and dangerous. 2 days later, she actually filed for a restraining order. The petition painted me as some unstable lunatic who verbally threatened community officials. It was total fiction, but the moment she filed it, the word threats became attached to my name in public court records. Thankfully, Judge Patricia Harris saw right through it and dismissed the request immediately. But the damage had already been done. Even without a conviction, the accusation alone made some people start treating me differently. At that point the stress started grinding me down. I'd sit on Pop's porch in the evenings with a beer in my hand and wonder if the fight was even worth it. I'd spent 30 years working for that peaceful retirement and now it was becoming a daily war zone. His old recliner didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like a reminder that I was responsible for preserving something much bigger than myself. And just when I was starting to consider walking away a broken bar, the community started to fight back. Judge William Bill Carter, a retired now, and an old fishing buddy of Pop's showed up at my door with a thermos of coffee and some very pointed advice. "Marcus, your grandfather would have seen through this mess in a heartbeat. Don't let her eyes let you. That's her whole strategy." He reminded me that harassment campaigns like this usually meant big money was on the line. Nobody goes to this much trouble over a simple neighborhood disagreement. Then the VFW, where I'd been a member for 2 decades, released a statement calling Karen's accusations baseless attacks against a respected member of the community. The Historical Society followed up, recognizing my cabin as one of the lake's last original heritage structures. Even the environmental conservation group publicly praised my off-grid setup as a model of sustainable living. For the first time in weeks, the pit in my stomach loosened. It finally felt like I wasn't alone. The stress was still there, broken bar, but now it was mixed with something that felt a lot like hope. Of course, Karen wasn't finished. Somehow, she convinced the utility company to launch an investigation into my electrical usage. For 3 whole days, I had no power while they reviewed my solar grid connection for potential violations. Then came the bogus police reports, a suspicious activity, possible domestic disturbances, alleged drug dealing based on unusual visitors. Those visitors were my old union buddies stopping by to show support. Every call brought deputies to my door. Every visit created another official incident report in my file. And who do you think responded most of the time? Deputy Chad Cromwell. He'd show up with that smug little grin, ask a few meaningless questions, and leave. One day he even said, "You know, Mr. Henley, if you just apologized to my aunt and brought your property into compliance, all of this would probably disappear." That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't just about me. It was a message to everyone else. A warning: bend the knee, or this happens to you too. Every ping from my phone started feeling like another attack waiting to happen. Some were, but others a broken bar. Others were messages of support from people I hadn't talked to in years. People I didn't even realize were still in my corner. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, I understood exactly how the game was being played. Ironically, the breakthrough happened while I was doing the most mind-numbing task imaginable, organizing paperwork for my upcoming meeting with the Attorney General's office. Chuck had arranged the whole thing and told me they needed clean, detailed documentation for their statewide HOA corruption probe. So there I was, sitting at Pop's old oak table, buried under a mountain of citations, inspection reports, and legal threats. A broken bar when one tiny line of print caught my eye. At the bottom of one of Karen's violation notices was a tiny footer I'd never paid attention to: fines payable to Lakeside Estates Community Improvement Fund, account number 847,291. It sounded official enough, but after 30 years of reading electrical contracts and spotting the sneaky fine print contractors used to rip people off, something about it didn't feel right. By this point, the county clerk's office had practically become my second home, and Betty didn't even need to ask what I was looking for when I requested whole financial records. She pulled the public filings like a seasoned blackjack dealer and laid them out on the counter. "Hoes have to file annual reports like any nonprofit," she said. "Take a look at this." The numbers didn't just look suspicious, they were downright impossible. Over the last 2 years, the HOA had collected $280,000 for emergency dock repairs that were never done. Another $150,000 supposedly paid to Cromwell Grounds Maintenance, a company that state records showed was owned by Karen's brother-in-law and had been incorporated exactly 3 weeks after she became HOA president. Pop always said, when someone starts a business right after getting power, They usually created it so they can pay themselves. Then came the insurance fraud. The HOA had filed storm damage claims 3 different times in the last 18 months. A broken bar, even though I'd lived through every one of those storms and not a single shingle had blown off any roof. Betty cross-checked the claim dates with National Weather Service data. The weather had been perfectly clear every single time. She leaned in and whispered, almost afraid the walls might overhear, "Marcus, a broken bar. This is fraud. Plain and simple fraud." My hands were literally trembling as I made copies. The papers felt heavier than normal, like I was holding evidence capable of changing everything. This wasn't just retaliation against me. It was a full-scale theft of the entire lake community. The final puzzle piece was buried in the property management fees. The HOA had been paying $5,000 a month to something called Clearwater Property Solutions for administrative services, but according to the business registry, the company's address was a P.O. Box A in the same zip code as Karen's house. Everything clicked into place. She wasn't just drunk on power. She was running a calculated scheme. Drive down property values, push longtime residents out, funnel the home money through shell companies, and sell the land to connected developers for massive profits. I thought about the Hendersons, probably sitting in some small apartment, counting pennies, and realized they'd been robbed twice. First by being pressured into selling their home for peanuts, a broken bar, and then by the HOA fees they'd unknowingly paid into Karen's personal slush fund. Pop always said corruption is never small, and he was right. Karen wasn't running an HOA, she was running a criminal organization. That night, I turned Pop's spare bedroom into what looked like the boardroom of a detective show. Maps of lakefront property boundaries covered the walls. Timelines tracked every harassment incident next to suspicious financial transactions. Photos, recordings, copies of checks, all cataloged and labeled based on potential criminal charges. The very next morning, 2 prosecutors from the Attorney General's office arrived. Sarah Mitchell, a sharp-eyed, calm, reminded me of the safety inspectors who kept us honest on job sites, and David Bennett, a younger, but with that quiet confidence of someone who's already put plenty of white-collar criminals behind bars. Sarah spread the documents across the table and said, "Mr. Hanley, a broken bar. This goes far beyond an HOA dispute. This is systemic fraud." David nodded, scrolling through a tablet. "We've seen the same pattern in 4 other counties. Politically connected individuals use HOA authority to manipulate property values and siphon funds out of community accounts." Then they told me the FBI was involved. Agent Rebecca Torres had been following similar development fraud cases, and my documentation filled the missing gap in multiple investigations. But they needed more, not just papers, witnesses, proof from multiple homeowners who'd experienced the same thing. That's where Chuck came through again. He'd quietly reached out to other families around the lake. 17 people showed up at the VFW hall. Their stories made my blood boil. The Thompsons paid $8,000 in bogus fines before finally selling their cabin for 30% under market value. The Garcas were hit with $12,000 in emergency assessments for lake improvements that never actually happened. Mrs. Patterson, 43 years in her home, had been so intimidated that she fled to her daughter's house in Florida just to feel safe. Every story followed the same script: fake violations, legal threats, non-stop harassment, forced sale, broken bar, and all of them had paid into the same community improvement fund that was really just Karen's private bank account. That's when Frank, the retired accountant, stepped in to analyze the financial records in more detail. HOAs have to file annual Form 1120 returns if they hit certain income levels, he explained. Legitimate ones file every year. Corrupt ones avoid it, because proper accounting exposes the theft. And sure enough, our HOA hadn't submitted a proper tax return in more than 2 years, despite collecting hundreds of thousands in dues and assessments. That single omission opened the door to potential federal tax evasion charges on top of everything else. At that point, the strategy meetings felt less like neighborhood drama and more like planning a military operation. We had the financial paper trail, we had witness statements, we had recorded evidence of harassment and sabotage, but Agent Torres wanted ironclad proof. She wanted Karen caught in the act. "The strongest case is when the suspect incriminates themselves on camera," she said. You need her to act." That's when Chuck came up with a brilliant idea. The Attorney General is about to announce new HOA reform legislation. What if she holds the press event at Marcus' cabin? It's symbolic, protecting homeowner rights at the exact site where those rights were violated. Sarah's eyes lit up immediately. And if Karen's pattern holds, she'll do everything in her power to disrupt it. Her need for control will override her caution. So we built what Agent Taboras called a controlled confrontation environment. Covert recording devices were installed throughout my cabin. Undercover officers were placed around the lake. Local and state law enforcement agencies coordinated response plans. Media outlets were quietly alerted and social media teams were ready to counter Karen's inevitable disinformation. My old union instincts kicked in. We drew up contingency plans for every possible outcome. Backup systems for the backup systems. The trap was set. Karen's behavior had become so predictable that we could practically script her next move. And sure enough, she delivered. It started small and my solar panels began randomly failing. Dead batteries, inverter errors. At first it looked like a mechanical glitch, a broken bar, until Jake took a closer look and found loosened connections that had been intentionally sabotaged. "Marcus," he said, snapping photos. "This is professional. Someone knows exactly what they're doing." Fortunately, Jake had installed a hidden camera near the electrical panel after the first incident. 2 nights later, the footage captured Karen herself creeping around my property at 3 a.m. with wire cutters and a screwdriver. Crystal clear face, license plate visible, the whole thing. The next attack hit even closer to home. I left for groceries and returned to find my boat floating halfway across the lake. Heavy-duty chains otherwise Pop installed himself had been cut clean through with bolt cutters. Finding Pop's boat scratched against the rocks felt like someone had defaced a family headstone. But the worst, the broken bar, the worst was my septic system. It had passed inspection just a few days earlier. Suddenly the entire thing backed up, filling the air with that unmistakable stench of raw sewage and chemical burn. When the emergency technician arrived, he found industrial-grade drain cleaner dumped into the system, killing all the bacteria and creating a hazardous chemical mess. "This wasn't vandalism," he said grimly, holding up a soil sample. "This was expert sabotage. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." While I was mopping up sewage in the backyard, Karen was orchestrating yet another media blitz. Anonymous accounts flooding social media with accusations that my property was collapsing, that I was ignoring safety orders, that the neighborhood was in danger. The bot accounts were laughably obvious. Identical wording, fake profile photos, dozens of posts appearing within minutes of each other. And then the intimidation phase ramped into overdrive. Deputy Chad's patrol cars started cruising past my cabin 4 or 5 times a day. Sometimes he parked in my driveway and ran the plates of anyone who visited. The building inspector suddenly found violations in work that had passed inspection only weeks earlier. Fire marshal reports, anonymous environmental complaints, all of it piling up. 1,000 tiny cuts designed to wear me down and show everyone else what happens if you refuse to submit. And now a broken bar. She wasn't just targeting me anymore. Karen didn't just keep her attacks focused on me. She started going after anyone who dared stand in my corner. Jake suddenly found his electrical contracting license under review for safety violations. Bill Carter, the retired judge who'd been giving me friendly advice, received a formal complaint with the state bar for allegedly providing unauthorized legal counsel. The VFW post came under threat of shutdown after a surprise fire safety inspection. The Historical Society got hit with zoning violations for their downtown office. In other words, the message was crystal clear: support Marcus Hanley and you're next. The psychological strain was relentless. Every morning brought a new emergency, a new letter, a new headache. It got to the point where the taste of stress was as familiar as my first cup of coffee. But there was an upside to Karen's panic. She was making mistakes, and every escalation she orchestrated was now being captured and logged by law enforcement. Each act of sabotage, every intimidation call, every bogus inspection, all of it was adding fuel to the legal fire building against her. Even her own allies were starting to distance themselves as her behavior became more erratic. Agent Taboras called it classic criminal escalation. Once these people feel cornered, they become reckless, and their recklessness becomes evidence. And that's exactly what happened. Her final move was so audacious that, for a moment, I almost admired the nerve. She'd found out through her husband's political contacts say that I wasn't just meeting with some mid-level bureaucrat. I was meeting directly with Attorney General Patricia Williamson. And instead of backing down, Karen went nuclear. Her plan was twisted but calculated. Reframe herself as a victim of a politically motivated attack, spin the narrative that the state's top prosecutor was targeting her family because of partisan politics. If she could confront the Attorney General on camera at my cabin and live stream the encounter, she could portray herself as a brave whistleblower exposing government corruption. The first signs came online. Radical government watchdog bloggers suddenly picked up a story about a small-town HOA president being persecuted by the state, local family targeted for political reasons. The headline screamed painting me as some kind of government stooge helping corrupt officials destroy innocent citizens. Within hours, angry comments from people who'd never even heard of Lakeside Estates were flooding social media feeds, calling Karen a hero and demanding the investigation be stopped. But Karen's masterstroke was the live stream. She'd set up a full broadcast plan intending to burst into my cabin during the meeting and stream the entire confrontation live to her followers as evidence of corruption in action. What she didn't know was that law enforcement had already obtained warrants to monitor her communications. We knew about the bloggers, the live stream, even the script she planned to recite during her spontaneous confrontation. Agent Taboras smiled when we reviewed the intel. She's about to commit multiple felonies on live camera and narrate her own motives in real time. It's the kind of evidence prosecutors dream about. By then, Karen's entire support system was collapsing. Other HOA board members quietly cut ties once the financial discrepancies surfaced. Her husband was now facing his own ethics investigation and could no longer shield her. Deputy Chad had been reassigned after Internal Affairs started asking why vandalism reports from my property had gone nowhere. But Karen didn't see any of it. She was unraveling calling neighbors at midnight, threatening anyone who supported me, muttering about conspiracies and hidden enemies. The night before the meeting, she called 4 different families and warned them there would be serious consequences if they continued cooperating with the investigation. All 4 calls were recorded. All 4 are now part of the case file under witness intimidation. I spent that final evening on Pop's porch, watching the sunset bleed across the lake. The loons called back and forth, and for the first time in a long while, I felt calm. Tomorrow, one way or another, this would end. It wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about whether people with power and connections can abuse entire communities and get away with it. I opened Pop's old leather Bible and reread the verse he'd underlined about David facing Goliath. He'd scribbled in the margin, "Sometimes the little guy wins because he's fighting for something bigger than himself." Morning came. The coffee tasted like victory even before I took the first sip. Attorney General Patricia Williamson wasn't what I expected. Instead of a stiff politician, she turned out to be a grounded, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, like the kind of principal who knows everyone's tricks and isn't afraid to call your bluff. She walked into the cabin right on time, thermos in one hand, a briefcase full of evidence in the other, and settled into Pop's old recliner like she'd been there 1,000 times. "Your documentation has helped us connect corruption cases in 6 other counties," Attorney General Williamson said, sifting through the files spread across Pop's table. "What you uncovered here isn't just a local fraud scheme. It's part of a much larger pattern of organized theft." We were in the middle of discussing potential indictments when the sound of a familiar engine tore through the conversation and the shrill roar of Karen's Escalade, screaming up my driveway like she was chasing a getaway car. Gravel flew. Car doors slammed. I could hear voices barking instructions. Get the audio ready. Check the angle. As she assembled her full social media film crew for what she clearly believed would be her defining moment. Agent Taboras whispered into her earpiece, "Showtime." The Attorney General didn't even look up. Outside, Karen's voice rose in righteous fury. "This is it. Folks, we're about to expose the corruption targeting our family. The state attorney general is illegally meeting with our harasser. Her heels hammered across my porch like a countdown clock. And then a crash. The door blew open in a shower of splintered wood. The attorney general's coffee mug hit the floor. Karen stormed into my living room, holding her phone high and live streaming the whole thing, completely unaware that she had just committed trespassing, breaking and entering, and assault in front of the state's top prosecutor. I demand to know why you're conspiring with this man, she screamed, waving her phone like a weapon. This is political persecution. Attorney General Williamson calmly stood from Pop's recliner and presented her identification. The look on Karen's face when she realized she'd just burst into a private meeting with the actual Attorney General and broadcasted live was priceless. Mrs. Cromwell, Williamson said in a voice that could make granite crack, you have just committed multiple felonies in my presence. And, thanks to your own live stream, your actions and statements have been broadcast to several thousand witnesses. Karen froze. Her phone kept streaming. The comment feed went from cheering her on to stunned disbelief. Yeah, broken bar, this is my community. I have jurisdiction, she stammered. That's when Agent Torres stepped through the doorway accompanied by two other federal agents. Mrs. Cromwell, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, and criminal harassment. And for the record, your confession is already circulating online. The snap of handcuffs echoed through the cabin like closure itself. Her phone hit the floor, still recording as the crowd of neighbors outside watched in stunned silence. I stood up, couldn't resist a small grin, and said, Karen, meet the Attorney General. She'd like to discuss her bookkeeping. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had driven in from her daughter's place just to see justice served, cried openly as Karen was led past the cabin, the dock, the solar panels, and the Escalade which was promptly towed as evidence. As she was hauled away, Karen hissed, this isn't over. My husband will fix this. Actually, it was over. And no, he couldn't fix it. 3 months later, watching her get sentenced felt like an early Christmas gift. Judge Harrison didn't just throw the book at her, he launched the entire library. 3 years in federal prison, $340,000 in restitution, lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board in the United States. Her husband wasn't far behind. He resigned in disgrace and got 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The corrupt HOA was dissolved almost immediately. In its place, we formed the Clearwater Lake Volunteer Association, and no mandatory fees, no citation authority, just neighbors helping neighbors. The fallout brought more than justice. I received whistleblower compensation for helping recover the stolen funds, a $45,000 check that felt like repayment for every sleepless night I'd endured. But even better, broken bar, the change started spreading. Attorney General Williamson used our case to write new legislation. The Hanley Act now requires independent financial audits for all HOAs and criminal penalties for harassment disguised as code enforcement. 3 more counties used our evidence to prosecute similar rings. The FBI ended up tying Karen's group to more than 24 cases across 5 states. And the people who had been driven out, they came back. The Hendersons bought a new place 2 lots down once their property value was restored. Mrs. Patterson moved back from Florida and threw a block party that went until sunrise. Property values skyrocketed. Turns out people like living in peaceful lake communities when there isn't an whole tyrant breathing down their necks. These days, the transformation goes far beyond legal victories. My off-grid cabin, once labeled an eyesore, now hosts monthly tours for clean energy programs. The state even featured our community in its sustainability showcase. I used part of my whistleblower reward to start the Pops Legacy Scholarship, pay $500 grants for kids entering trade school, just like Pop would have wanted. The Lake Festival is now a regional tradition that funds housing for veterans. Last year, we paid for 3 tiny homes. The smell of barbecue and sound of families laughing has replaced the fear Karen cultivated. But the best part is the quiet. Right now, as I write this, I'm sitting on Pop's porch watching the lake glow under purple gold sunset. The loons are calling across the water. The solar panels hum. There are no inspection notices, no anonymous tips, no designer heels clacking down my dock at dawn. Just peace and proof that sometimes when the little guy stands up for what's right, David really does beat Goliath. Because sadly a broken bar Karen wasn't unique. There are more just like her out there. So now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with your own whole nightmare story. Trust me, you are not alone. Hit the subscribe button if you want more real stories of everyday people taking down corrupt systems. And get ready, next week I'll tell you about the city councilman who tried to shut down a veteran's food truck. A broken bar until some of the owner's old Pentagon buddies decided to pay a visit. Thanks for watching. Ho Secrets say where the Karens finally meet their match.